Hello, everyone, once again. I'm here with my beautiful friend and I don't know, partner in crime, shall I call you that? Clinical psychotherapist Jacqueline Byrne, specialized in disorder thoughts around food and training, eating disorders, and so much more than that. Today we're here to discuss a very important topic, which is called I Don't Have the Money, How Can I Recover? What can I do if I don't have the resources? And I really would like to start this conversation by saying that there was a point in time where I felt exactly the same. I don't have the money, I'm studying, I'm working, I cannot really invest in my health. And I tended to put myself second, third, or sometimes even 10th. And the reality is that everything is a priority, right? Everything is important until you don't have your health. Like going on holiday is important, buying the latest pair of shoes is important, going to the cinema with your friends. And true, they're all very important things, like having your coffee every day, getting your coffee outside every day, super important. And we are completely on the same wavelength. But the reality is that being in a state of disease and unease, it's very taxing and very expensive on a psychological, emotional, physical, and spiritual level. And I'm really guilty of finding myself in a place where I was struggling to allow myself to find the right support and to invest time, energy, and money into finding some guidance and support. But when I finally did, miracle happened. And it also made me realize that I wasn't seeking the support because of the mindset, the scarcity mindset that was really brewing underneath and was driving most of my actions and thoughts and behaviors. What about you, Jacqueline?
I appreciate you sharing that so much. I think so many of our listeners will relate to it. And I've definitely, in that experience of not deserving or not being good enough type of thinking, not seen it as a possibility to let myself have access to certain things. And I thought it would be helpful to break that down a little bit today, because there is some assumed privilege, of course, in there being enough money to have any of these things. And there might be some listeners who, at times in their life or even presently, it's genuinely not a possibility from any way of looking at it. However, so many people that develop an eating disorder are black and white thinkers, are perfectionistic thinkers, and have obsessive compulsive tendencies, which can show up around money very similarly to food, like counting money and wasting money, feeling very comparable to maybe wasting calories or having a feeling of guilt around spending and comfort in additional savings. Also, we might have belief systems about what kind of person we are if we're spending on certain categories. So if I'm spending money on going to the movies with my friends or getting a coffee, those are seen as normal, in inverted commas, things to do. But if I'm spending money on treatment, there can sometimes be a belief almost like, I shouldn't have to do that. Or if I do have to, something's really wrong. And then I have to come into contact with that reality that it truly is that priority in my life because it's that threatening. Versus if I'm not willing to spend money on it, I can kind of excuse it as a luxury that I just can't afford right now. So again, I want to emphasize that there are people in Australia that hands down cannot afford access to treatment. And there isn't a lot that's available without having some ability to pay for a gap in that sense. But there is another category of people that feel like they're in that first category. But if they actually sat down and looked at the money that's coming into their world and out of their world, it might be possible, but there's a choice being made around whether it's okay with them. There was a study done in 2015 by Deloitte on the cost of eating disorders to the Australian economy, and it was in the tens of billions of dollars, billions, because of sick leave, physical sicknesses that come up due to eating disorders, mental health consequences of eating disorders, people having accidents like car accidents or falling over or other medical complications. infertility, fertility treatment. If you think about eating disorders and HA really being at the very crux of what affects everything, because they're an illness that affects every cell of a person's body, as well as their mental health well-being, it affects every facet of our life. So if we appreciate that it's costing tens of billions of dollars at a macro level, we can appreciate what it's costing at a micro level, which I think is what you're speaking to. Like, what's the cost of not doing it? And we often don't think about it in that way, especially if we're in a perfectionistic mindset. We think, well, you can't have that until you're earning this much, or until you go without this, then you can't afford this other product or support. But if we flipped that to think about, what does it cost me by not having access to it, and what's that cost going to be in 5 years or 10 years? It's hard to imagine that it couldn't be the top priority.
And you hit the nail in the head, because it's also the perfectionist mentality. Because maybe someone really would like to find the right support and guidance, and she goes and look for all the options, and then time goes by, and then she comes back to assessing all the same options once again, and just measuring if they are affordable enough for her in the specific situation in reality, to then decide that because it's too overwhelming, it's better to do nothing. And not doing anything is actually an action that someone is still taking, an action against the recovery journey. And when you mention the cost of having an eating disorder, hypothalamic amenorrhea, and so on and so forth, I am absolutely with you, because if you think about fertility, if someone goes down the path of fertility treatment, it can cost easily, if everything goes super well, and if someone gets pregnant at the first go, we're still looking at somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 in AUD. And then if you're looking at a bone fracture, so having to do surgery, seeing the endocrinologist, seeing the surgeon, it's nowhere shy than 10,000 at least. And I know that very well. So yeah, the cost of inaction, of not doing anything to recover from hypothalamic amenorrhea and an eating disorder is very expensive. And as you mentioned, some people can really not afford it. And thankfully, here in Australia, we are very lucky, because we can ask the support from the GP, and then the GP can refer us on. It's not the same thing in the United States and in the UK, unfortunately. But then there is also a very strong shame component, and also being in denial. And normally when someone feels ashamed of the situation that she's in, doesn't want to share, doesn't want to ask for help. And there is that belief that I did it to myself, so I'm gonna fix myself, and then can postpone recovery by how long, Jacqueline, realistically speaking?
So many years and years. It makes me so sad to think about that, because with a medical illness, I don't think we consider in that way, that we did this to ourselves. Like, our body created this physical illness, so we aren't allowed to have access to treatment. We'd probably, if anything, judge someone more for not accessing medical treatment for a physical disorder. But when it comes to a mental health disorder, the onus is on the person, as if that was a choice they made. They woke up one day and decided to have an eating disorder, and so it's their choice not to, or their choice to turn it around if they really wanted to. Eating disorders are actually considered one of the most complex psychiatric conditions, and endocrinology is one of the most complicated areas of medicine, which places EDs and HA right at the crux of, if anything was going to be supported by external help and support, these conditions are so justified. And it's very, very difficult to recover without support. Ideally, medical, dietetic, and psychological support concurrently, but at least one of those components to recover without some support is the statistics are pretty dire. And so it's a condition that is accumulative in its risk. So if you've already had an eating disorder for 10 years, HA for 5 years, 7 years, it's human nature to look back on the data we've collated to try and predict what we're moving into. So maybe if no serious health issues have played out yet, we predict it's just going to be more of the same, maybe for the next 10 years. but that's incorrect, that the risk escalates with every year, with every month of not having a period. The health risk associated with that escalates. And every day there hasn't been a medical consequence from the eating disorder to date, chances are there increasingly will be that day on the other side.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned eating disorder in conjunction with the lack of period. Some women, they do manage to recover their period on their own, but sometimes I have conversation with women that have had an eating disorder for 10 to 15 years, and they do decide to get their period back by themselves. And absolutely, if that's what you feel like doing, go for it. But the reality is that eating disorder, lack of period, yes, they are part of the same umbrella. They are under the same umbrella, but an eating disorder needs to be treated like a proper medical condition. And if someone will come to you and said, I have cancer, of course you would expect that person to receive treatment as soon as possible. But for some reason, when you have someone that is suffering from an eating disorder, maybe it's restricting, maybe it's counting calories, maybe is suffering from binging episodes on a daily basis, and at the same time the reproductive system have completely shut down, for some reason doctors are not really that preoccupied, which it baffles me. I don't really understand where the missing link is, because as you said, the study was done in 2015, and there are so many longitudinal studies that have been done in the past few years that shows that it's really impacting our society and our medical system in a very severe level. So where is the missing link?
Exactly.
Sorry, it's just me getting baffled every single time that I think about it.
Oh, it's a collective bafflement. Absolutely. It's quite perplexing. And I think it does take so long for what we know in research to trickle down into our collective consciousness, into our social psyches, that so many of the ideas about how we operate individually and within systems like medical systems are hugely outdated, but still persist. And that does unfortunately put the onus on the person who is experiencing HA and or an ED, that sometimes self-advocacy is needed, and the willingness to look at that truth, the factors of truth for yourself, is such a courageous act, because maybe it is easier or more available to duck and weave the realities of an eating disorder, even the health realities, physical health realities of an ED, than it is, say, for cancer, because of the way that our society thinks about it and that support is structured. But I think that's a brilliant comparison. You know, we would think it was absurd if someone didn't seek treatment after a cancer diagnosis or symptoms that seem to be suspiciously like a cancer presentation. We would see that as irresponsible. We would see that as reckless. And yet it's sobering. But from a statistical perspective, a woman under 50 is more likely to die of an eating disorder and complications thereof than of cancer. So we really don't see the risk that we're encountering. And I'm not interested in fear-mongering anyone. This isn't about scaring people into action, because that's not a helpful source of motivation. But I do think there's a responsibility when you and I hear a lot around people feeling reluctant to enter treatment because of something like money. If there is any possibility of prioritizing recovery, that is the smartest thing you could do. And I don't know anyone that's regretted it.
Absolutely. And we also need to take into consideration that there may be a familiar component, meaning that if you are brought up in a household where health was not prioritized and was seen as to be okay to be sick, and was seen as being weak, perceived weak, to complain about any type of illness, please remember that you can stop the generational trauma. if your parents were behaving a certain way, if the people around you are still behaving in a certain way, that does not mean that you cannot prioritize your own health. And I'm speaking to all the women that are listening to us today, live or on replay, you can still prioritize your health, even though the people around you, they don't think that it's a priority. Even when your GP, your medical doctor, does not believe that it's a priority, because as women, we have a very strong intuition. And when we tap into our innate wisdom, we already know what we need to prioritize. Because if you ask me, what do you need right now, Claudia? And I take all the load away from my brain and I just place my hand on my heart, I have the answer. I have the answer. Is that fearful to actually listen to that type of answer? Absolutely, yes, because it requires me to take actions, to do things that are outside of my comfort, my familiar zone, not comfort zone. But still, I know that my health will benefit tremendously if I did them. And also one thing that I would like to say, if someone is listening to us and they think that they don't have the money to seek support, ask. Because sometimes people may be surprised about the cost they can receive. Maybe they can ask for a discount. Maybe they can ask for a payment plan. Maybe they can ask for a low level of support in the beginning. And then when they get the money, they can move into a higher level of support. Maybe they can ask for a loan. Maybe they can ask their parents and friends. Maybe they can set up their own account when they ask help to people outside of their support net to see if they can receive something extra. I feel that it's always better to ask, it's always better to investigate instead of sitting in loneliness, wondering why is no one helping me. And the truth is that Jacqueline and I know how we work. And if there is anyone that really needs the help, we tend to find ways around it, or at least we can send resources, or we can refer them on to someone that can actually do it if we are completely booked out, or we cannot really take on another client. Jacqueline, what do you have to say around that?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because sometimes people do hear rumors of treatment costs, or different types of treatment can cost very different investment levels. And there might be assumptions made that stop someone even inquiring on a service that would have been attainable for them. But also, as you said, there can be so many different ways of structuring it that can make it more accessible than it might seem. And sometimes there's a mentality, probably with that black and white perfectionistic thinking as well, that if I can't afford to do it every week, or I can't afford to have a nutritionist and a therapist and a GP, seeing them all every week, then there's no point to starting, because that's the gold standard. And if I can't do that, there's no point in starting. Something is better than nothing by so far. So even if it was having more space between sessions, or just seeing one practitioner and then a different practitioner. And a lot of practitioners like you and I would recommend resources, as you mentioned. So there's books you can be reading, there's podcasts you can be listening to, there's online groups you could partake in to support maybe sessions that are spaced out more than ideal, but you are beginning that process, and you are sending the message to yourself that it matters enough to start to make changes.
It's a message of safety, right? Like telling yourself that you are good enough to receive help, and that you're good enough to invest in yourself, and also that you don't have to do it alone. And I think that what we are saying in this conversation is that sometimes not having money, yes, could be a real thing, but possibly most of the time is also very much connected to the scarcity mentality that gives people an eating disorder in the first place. And I normally see that with people, women with hypothalamic amenorrhea, they tend to suffer from that restrictive mentality. I'm just gonna book the holiday only when I'm gonna invest in myself only when and there is always that procrastination. And at the same time, those people are also the most generous, so they're not afraid of sharing whatever they have with the people that they love. So it's definitely about time. Let's say that this conversation could be a wake-up call in terms of invest in yourself. You matter, you're worth it. And if you're listening to Jacqueline and I today, chances are that you're looking for that support or guidance. So if you haven't taken the plunge yet, just make sure that you prioritize yourself, whatever that means for you. Start from the low-hanging fruit, and then, but just start. That's all I'm saying. Start in a very imperfect way. There is no right or wrong anyway. The recovery journey, it doesn't last only 1 month, and there is no right or wrong way of doing it. I think that the cost of inaction, it's pretty clear to everyone that has listened to this conversation right now, and so this is just a reminder of do it, like Nike used to say. Do you have any last word of wisdoms that you would like to share, Jacqueline, before we close this conversation?
I just want to highlight what you mentioned, because I think there's such truth in that. Sometimes there's a readiness coming in part of us that our dominant self isn't quite open to. But if you're drawn to listen to this conversation, even if while you're listening you think, well, they don't understand, I really don't have enough money, I have to pay for this, this, and this, there is a part of you that is curious, and that's wonderful. And I just ask you to give that part a bit of attention and inquire with it, and reach out to us. Just open up a conversation. There's no obligation from there, but start to get information, so at least you're checking out your assumptions are correct.
Yeah, I love that. And for all of you listening, if you want to get in contact with Jacqueline, she's at Wings and Quills, and I'm going to post it on the comment section below. And I will personally see you all tomorrow. Jacqueline, thank you so much for being here. I loved talking to you about this topic of conversation because it's so very near and dear to my heart. And I was the person that was counting calories and also checking my finances on a daily basis, 30 times a day. And that wasn't a really enjoyable place where to be. So it really resonates with me. And I do understand how much it really pushed my recovery backward. I don't know. But you know exactly what I'm
do.
I will see you next month for another lovely conversation. And I wish you a wonderful day for now.
Likewise. Bye-bye, everyone.